Good evening and welcome to NTD News. I'm Stephania Cox. Here are today's top stories. Hamas has now fired over 3,000 rockets into Israel, and Israel has killed one more terrorist leader. This as the death toll is rising. The amount of fentanyl seized at the southern border jumped eightfold last month compared to April last year. The amount of heroin at the border is also a troubling figure. A Space Force officer was fired after his public comments criticizing the military's embrace of critical race theory. Now, two former military members are speaking out against the decision. They say socialist teachings could harm our forces. And a senator comes to a disturbing conclusion about the cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline. He says there's no easy fix. The Israeli military announced that a top Islamic Jihad commander was killed in an Israeli airstrike this morning. This comes days after the Israeli military handed Hamas a severe blow, reducing the terrorist group's ability to launch rockets into Israeli communities. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
Senior Islamic Jihad commander Hussam Abu Harbid was killed this morning in an Israeli airstrike. Abu Harbid led attacks against Israeli soldiers and civilians for the past 15 years. This was one more major deterring blow to terrorist groups in Gaza. In an interview with Skype News London, retired British naval officer Colonel Richard Kemp said the latest Israeli military maneuver to destroy the terrorist tunnels in Gaza was one of the best he has seen in his career. The Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, on Thursday lined up their ground forces, including tanks, artillery, and infantry along the Gazan border. The world media picked it up, and Hamas saw that the Israeli military was staged on the border for what appeared to be preparation for a ground invasion into Gaza. Hundreds of terrorists in Gaza began running into their underground tunnel network, known as the Metro, which contains weapons, command and control facilities, and shelter.
They went down into there, and immediately they were inside. The IDF then attacked those tunnels with 160 aircraft, which dropped JDAM bunker buster bombs and destroyed large parts of the tunnels. And then when some of the terrorists came out, they then got hit as well from the air. So it was I think, as you said, a strategic victory, really, for Israel, which will probably prove to be a turning point in this conflict and really hit Hamas with an absolute body blow.
Israel destroyed over 9 miles of underground tunnels in Gaza. The Israeli prime minister does not plan to let up anytime soon, and he says he will do what is needed to keep Israeli citizens safe.
The directive is to continue to strike at terror targets. The IDF is doing well. Today it has eliminated another senior Islamic Jihad commander. We have hit a Hamas naval unit, and we continue to strike at underground infrastructure, the Hamas Metro, and other targets. We will continue to act as necessary to restore peace and security to all residents of Israel.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has discussed the situation in Gaza with Qatari, Egyptian, and Saudi foreign ministers, but there is still no ceasefire in sight. Jason Perry, NTD News.
And Secretary of State Antony Blinken says there's a false equivalence being made between Hamas and Israel. He told Norway's TV2 that it's false to equate the terror group Hamas attacking Israeli citizens and the state of Israel defending itself. NTD spoke with an expert on the Middle East about Biden's role in the conflict and the proportionality of attacks from both sides.
Which is a completely different front.
Nevit Basker is a policy advisor and an expert on the Middle East and Israel. She addresses the claim that Hamas's recent attack on Israel is a response to Israeli police clashes with Palestinians near Al-Aqsa Mosque, a mosque that the Hamas leader said is the trigger of their revolutions.
That is what Hamas said. Hamas said it was in response to the police response to the riot on the Temple Mount. But in fact, they've been amassing these rockets for many years now. The actual timing probably had more to do with internal Palestinian politics. There was an election that was scheduled for next week and was canceled, and there was a lot of frustration about that. So this is really an internal power struggle between Palestinian factions that plays out in rockets on Israeli civilians.
Some say the change in administration in the U.S. led to Hamas's attacks against Israel. For example, former President Trump, who partially brokered peace deals in the Middle East, and ex-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Biden's weakness and signal led to Hamas's attacks. But Basker says she doesn't see Biden as the cause for the attacks.
I don't believe there's a major change in the American outlook. The Biden administration has supported the Abraham Accords. The Biden administration and the Trump administration and every administration going back since the 70s has supported a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The strategies might be a little different, the contours might be a little different, but I don't think that those played a major role, other than possibly letting the Hamas leadership believe that they could get away with shooting at Israeli civilians.
According to the Israeli Defense Force, 10 Israeli civilians have been killed after Hamas launched over 3,000 rockets. That's because of Israel's Iron Dome, an air defense system designed to intercept and destroy rockets. This contrasts with over 145 people killed by Israeli airstrikes, according to the Anadolu agency. Basker comments on the disproportionate number of deaths.
Hamas is targeting civilians in Israel and hiding among civilians in Gaza. It's a double war crime. They're using their own civilians as human shields, and that's why Palestinians are getting hurt and injured. Some of them are bystanders. Some of them are injured by Hamas rockets falling short. But it's all due to Hamas's aggression against Israel and complete disregard even for its own civilians' well-being.
According to the Washington Post, Biden has confirmed an over $700 million sale of precise guided weapons to Israel. Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
Some concerning figures about the situation at the southern border. The Texas governor is saying there was an 800% increase in fentanyl intercepted at the Texas-Mexico border last month. Meanwhile, a former border agent admits she brought a foreign national illegally into the U.S. NTD's Allison Lee has the details.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott told Fox News last Friday that the border situation is dangerous, not only because of illegal immigration, but also because of the uptick in deadly drugs coming across the border.
We had over an 800 or almost 800% increase April over April about the amount of fentanyl that has been apprehended by the Texas Department of Public Safety. We have obtained enough fentanyl coming across the border to kill every single person in the state of New York.
Abbott wants Americans to know how deadly fentanyl is. Just 2 milligrams of it can kill a person, he says. The governor then adds that Texas law enforcement alone has apprehended over 30,000 illegal border crossers and arrested 900 criminals. On the national level, Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, says they apprehended nearly 180,000 people at the border in April. That's the highest one-month total in 2 decades, and a tenfold increase compared to April 2020. The amount of heroin seized at the border jumped almost 100%, and fentanyl over 30% from March to April this year. And also on Friday last week, former CBP officer Rhonda Lee Walker of Texas pled guilty to helping bring a Mexican woman illegally into the country. Walker was a CBP officer when she helped the illegal immigrant cross the border in January and lied to authorities about their relations. Walker later made the migrant work for her as a nanny. The former border agent could face up to 10 years in prison and a maximum $250,000 fine. A U.S. District Court judge will sentence her in August. Allison Lee, NTD News.
The Supreme Court won't make it easier for police to enter homes without a warrant to seize handguns. The justices unanimously rejected the Biden administration's arguments that pushed for restrictions on the Second Amendment. This includes controversial red flag laws, which allow gun seizures from law-abiding gun owners with limited due process. Generally, police can't conduct searches of private property without consent or a warrant. But the case in question centers on a doctrine that gives officers leeway in cases of community caretaking. Here's the context for the case. In an argument with his wife, a Rhode Island man pulled out an unloaded gun and asked her to put him out of his misery. Worried he may be suicidal, the wife asked the police to check. While he was out, they seized his guns without a warrant and didn't return them. This ruling says caretaking duties doesn't justify warrantless searches and seizures in the home. And the Supreme Court agrees to hear a dispute over a Mississippi abortion law. The law bans all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy, except for medical emergencies or severe abnormalities in the fetus. The case could put the Roe v. Wade ruling into question. The case was brought to the highest court by the Attorney General of Mississippi. This is after a federal appeals court ruled the abortion ban placed a burden on women who want to have abortions. But the Supreme Court wants to focus only on the issue of whether pre-viability bans on abortions are unconstitutional. The court's earlier rulings established women can get abortions before the fetus is viable. Last term, the court blocked a limit on abortions in Louisiana. But the outcome of the current case could be different since the court now has some more conservative justices after Justice Amy Coney Barrett was appointed last year. They will start hearing arguments for the case in October. And the heat is rising on Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz after his friend, a Florida politician, pleaded guilty to sex trafficking and 5 other charges. NTD's Steve Lance brings us more from Washington, D.C.
Florida tax collector Joel Greenberg pleaded guilty on Monday to 6 federal charges. He's agreeing to cooperate with authorities as part of his plea deal. Some say this could impact his friend, Congressman Matt Gaetz, whose Justice Department investigation is underway over allegations of sex trafficking. Though Gaetz was not mentioned in Greenberg's court hearing or plea deal. In exchange for Greenberg's guilty pleas, prosecutors dropped 27 other counts they were preparing to charge him with. The 6 offenses he pled guilty to include sex trafficking a minor, identity theft, wire fraud, and federal conspiracy. When it comes to whether Greenberg has information that might incriminate Congressman Gaetz, after his guilty plea, Greenberg's attorney said this in front of the federal courthouse in downtown Orlando.
Does my client have information that could hurt an elected official? I guess this is just, must-see television. You'll just have to wait and see.
As it stands, Greenberg faces a maximum of up to 10 years in prison. However, if he cooperates as expected and plays a substantial role in building cases against others involved, he could see a much lesser sentence than the 10 years he is facing now. Federal prosecutors are investigating whether or not Gaetz was involved with Greenberg. While the outspoken congressman denies wrongdoing, he was quiet on Monday, with only one tweet coming out of his official Twitter account by afternoon. Gaetz is a rising star in the Republican Party, and if he is found to be associated with any of these sexual misconduct allegations, this would surely tarnish any future political aspirations he might have. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Steve Lance, NTD News.
Following the hacking and shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline, a Republican senator said the country has a serious problem with its cybersecurity. He also said a Green New Deal would make things worse.
Senator Ron Johnson said Sunday that the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack and shutdown exposed existential-level vulnerabilities in America's fuel and electrical grid. Johnson said cybersecurity is a devil of a problem, adding there are no easy solutions. Colonial Pipeline, which delivers about 45% of the fuel consumed on the East Coast, halted operations last week after revealing it had been targeted by hackers. The shutdown affected gasoline supplies in parts of the East Coast, with some people waiting for hours at gas stations. The situation got worse from panic buying. Colonial said Saturday it has returned its systems to normal operations. The Wisconsin Republican said part of the fix is holding cyber attackers accountable. He said these hacker groups should be made to pay for these types of intrusions. Johnson also argued that the Democrats' Green New Deal would make the problem worse. He said Biden's plan to adopt some of the proposals in the Green New Deal could make the country's power grid more vulnerable. The senator said, with everybody hooking up their solar panels and hooking into the grid so they can get a few shekels for the electricity they're selling into the grid, we become more and more vulnerable, arguing that it will create more points of contact that cyber attackers can exploit.
There's been mounting pressure and opposition for Pennsylvania to join the RGGI. It's a mandatory market-based program to lower greenhouse gas emissions. A Pennsylvania state senator warns the program will make things worse while doing little to reduce greenhouse gases. NTD's Don Tran has the details.
The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, has control over several states when it comes to how much energy they can generate from natural gas. The purpose is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save the Earth from climate change. They virtually have the entire Northeast in their grasp, except for Pennsylvania. But one state senator says the program is a superficial attempt to fight global warming.
It just makes no sense whatsoever. It's going to do nothing but hurt Pennsylvania. It's going to raise Pennsylvania's electric cost eventually. I mean, the governor says he's going to raise $300 million off of this. Well, where's the $300 million going to come from? It's going to come from the ratepayers.
Pennsylvania's Governor Tom Wolf attempted to bring the state into RGGI. The move is seen as an overreach of power by some lawmakers, and they sent a letter to RGGI to bar the state's entrance unless the legislature approves. Senator Yaw says that not only will the program take away jobs from people in Pennsylvania, energy companies will outsource their labor, which will harm the environment.
I just think that we're kind of being hypocrites about it. The United States, our emissions have basically been flatlined for the past 10 years. Pennsylvania's emissions have gone down by, I think it's something like in the neighborhood of 30% in the last 10 years. So if we don't keep those manufacturing, keep the energy here so that we can support manufacturing, it's going to go somewhere else. It's going to go outside the United States. And it's going to go to locations that have much less environmental concerns than what we have here in the United States.
The senator stressed that the state needs to look at the bigger picture, instead of making a knee-jerk reaction in one target area to save some emissions. Don Tran, NTD News.
Families with kids can expect a monthly check of around $300 per kid starting July. That's according to President Biden. The expanded child tax credit is part of the virus spending bill passed this year.
And eligible families will receive a monthly payment of up to $300 per month for each child under the age of 6 and up to $250 per month for each child age 6 until the year they turn over age 6, till they...
Annually, families will get $3,600 per child under 6 years old and $3,000 per child over 6. The benefit will reach 39 million households. The Biden administration says the plan is to help the economy recover from the pandemic, but others are worried about the debt and the impact on inflation. Prices are already rising significantly this year, which hurts lower-income earners more. Republicans don't want two more expensive plans Biden is trying to pass and say they won't support any plan that raises taxes. And the New York Yankees outbreak is getting worse. Another member has tested positive for COVID. NTD's Miguel Moreno has the details.
The Yankees are reporting breakthroughs. Not the good kind. One more fully vaccinated member has tested positive for COVID, bringing the total to 9. Manager Aaron Boone says the newest member to be infected feels good, but 9 breakthrough cases in the same team. Is this normal?
No, obviously it's not normal, but I think the reality is it's to be expected.
CEO Gerald Komisong of Todos Medical, a company that helps labs ramp up their COVID testing, says the message has been clear. You may not be totally infection-proof after getting the shot.
Breakthrough cases are rare, but in this case we have 9 Yankees members testing positive for COVID. Could this mean that the vaccines aren't working as well as they should?
The question of how rare a breakthrough case is entirely dependent on the testing. If you're not testing everybody who's been vaccinated, you'll have no idea how rare those cases really are. And so I think that's the practical reality. I think the vaccines are doing the job that they were asked to do, which is to not allow people to get sick. But the question of whether or not, people can still get COVID and transmit COVID, I think they've been from the beginning, pretty clear that people who are vaccinated still can get COVID. It's just that they're much less likely to get sick.
The Yankees say only 1 member suffered symptoms. The rest, nothing but a positive test. At least 8 members who tested positive got the Johnson & Johnson one-shot vaccine, which is the weakest among U.S. vaccines at preventing illness. Over 9,000 breakthrough cases have been reported to the CDC, but based on what Komisong said, that number could be far, far larger. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
Record numbers of people died from drug overdoses last year. Two factors are likely behind the surge. One is being cooped up in lockdowns, and the other is not being able to carry out their routines. NTD's Christina Kim speaks to an addiction expert to shed some light on this.
The CDC's data on fatal drug overdose shows drug deaths surged 30% in the United States last year. A graph shows the rising trend. In the 12-month period ending in October 2020, there were nearly 89,000 drug overdose deaths. And nearly all 50 states, except South Dakota and Alaska, show a rise in fatal drug overdoses.
The stage was already set for the perfect storm to happen.
Dr. Indra Sidambi, a psychiatrist and expert in addiction medicine, says this isn't surprising, especially given the pandemic.
As an addiction specialist, I was anticipating the number to go up. And so it did not surprise me.
So what is this perfect storm? Sidambi says drugs are readily available and very cheap. People began self-medicating, and many, especially women, couldn't ask for support because they were too busy juggling their many responsibilities. This was exacerbated because of the pandemic and lockdowns, because those seeking help couldn't find it.
The problem was these programs were not available in person. So they had to scramble. In the initial stages, we didn't even have any meetings that was going on. And so these people were already struggling to keep themselves sober, now had no more support.
One drug in particular seems to play a large role in the rise of overdose deaths: fentanyl. Dr. Sidambi says the country's fentanyl crisis starts with too much availability and that it's coming in from outside the country.
If we were to say, I'm going to be strict at the borders and stuff like that, that's not enough because you can buy it on the dark web. So I think awareness, education is very important. Educate people and say this is a deadly one.
Sidambi says the first step to recovery is for people to speak openly about their problems. She says more than 50% of people can recover from outpatient treatments where they don't have to uproot their lives to get help. Sidambi says there's hope for recovery. She's seen addicts go on to stay sober and become successful. She says people can lead a truly dignified, quality life by taking good care of themselves. Christina Kim, NTD News.
A U.S. Space Force officer was relieved of his command after he made comments about his new book, which claims Marxist ideology is influencing the military. NTD's Christina Kim speaks to a veteran who says this is sending the wrong message to our adversaries.
Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer was relieved from his post on Friday after he spoke on a podcast about his new book. He criticized the Defense Secretary's agenda to promote critical race theory within the military in recent months. The Space Force said the decision was based on a loss of trust and confidence in his ability to lead. Lohmeyer's book is #1 on Amazon's bestsellers list and is currently sold out. Special Forces veteran, author, and head of a security think tank, Jim Hansen, says Lohmeyer's writings weren't in line with the military's new stance.
I think the fact that the U.S. military has decided that members of its officer corps are not allowed to express constitutionally protected speech in their off time is a serious problem. And I think in addition, it's a message to our enemies right now that they are more committed to being woke than they are to being mission capable.
Hansen says woke ideologies, including critical race theory and anti-racism, are simply new flavors of Marxism. Teaching this to the military is using the enemy's weapons against the country. He says this ideology will break the camaraderie that's necessary to carry out missions.
It didn't matter to me what color someone's skin was. What mattered to me was, could they pull their weight in the mission we were trying to accomplish? And if they could, I could have cared less. And that's now come into question because they're telling people that if you're black, you're being held back. And if you're white, you're an oppressor. That is not how you build the kind of esprit de corps a military unit needs and the morale that a unit needs to be able to have its people look at each other as individuals, not as members of some identity politics class.
Hansen says these teachings have infiltrated other sectors of society, like the education system.
Socialist-derived ideologies and governing principles have never worked anywhere on earth. They've been implemented, and they never will, because that's not how humans work.
He says we need to return to meritocracy in the government and military. But it's going to take time to wake people back up from wokeness. Christina Kim, NTD News.
And a retired naval intelligence officer also speaks out. He says this widespread infiltration of identity politics won't strengthen our troops.
Lieutenant Stephen Rogers says in his 25 years of military service, he has never seen anything like this.
As a military officer who's retired from the Navy, it was very troubling to see a U.S. military general relieve someone from command because he merely spoke out against Marxism, communism, if you will. When I joined the military several years ago, we were told that the Marxists and the communists were enemies. Now, not only am I very disturbed about this, but I've spoken to many veterans and many American citizens who love our country and who absolutely despise Marxism and communism. They're equally as shocked.
In recent months, we've seen more and more identity politics and critical race theory in the U.S. military and intelligence communities. It usually appears in the form of inclusion, diversity, and equity, and it's sparked outrage and concern among many Americans. Critical race theory draws heavily upon Marxist theories. It denounces Western culture as a form of oppression, and it applies the Marxist tactic of class struggle to divide people by race, gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity to label them oppressors and the oppressed. Rogers says it appears the U.S. military is embracing this ideology by relieving this commanding officer and investigating whether his comments constituted prohibited partisan political activity.
We used to have military commanders who would stand up for this country, stand up for freedom of speech, stand up for the troops, stand against communism, socialism, and Marxism. And what we have here is the complete opposite.
Last week, over 120 retired generals, admirals, and military officers signed a letter warning that the U.S. is embroiled in an existential fight between Marxism and constitutional freedom. Rogers is also urging more Americans to stand up and fight for America's freedoms and values. He says the first step is prayer, second, action.
There's a God above who loves this country. I believe in the power of prayer, but also we need to put our faith to work. Get involved, really get involved. Run for office, get involved with political candidates who are more interested in the American agenda rather than in an agenda of some politician or of Marxism and communism. And let me just make one thing really clear. Marxism, communism is indeed, in this century, a very clear, real, and present danger to the United States of America. We should not underestimate what the Chinese Communist Party and others are trying to do to our country. That should cause us concern, but it should also cause us to unite, and with all our might, with all our heart, soul, and spirit, is to fight them and send them back where Reagan sent the Soviet Communist Party into the ash bin of history.
And coming up, a Southern California fire has 2 suspected arsonists. Local residents protest to recall a council member who decided to put the homeless near their fire safety zone. If you're fully vaccinated, the Centers for Disease Control says you don't have to wear masks or social distance in most settings in the U.S., but it's more strict in California.
There's cultures that have been lost, but this culture hasn't been. The artist is showing us our sense of who we are, where we came from. You look at his hat. His hat is knitted probably by a man because a man traditionally knitted the hats. That hat tells you the story of who this person is, what his place in the culture is, the animals around him. Everything's all contained in the messages in the hat. And the tool that he's carrying over his shoulder. This is a centuries-old tool that has been able to rework the mountains. Those traditions are invaluable, and if we don't honor those traditions, then we're rootless. The artist is showing us the value of maintaining our culture and respecting our culture.
A Southern California fire has been growing this past weekend, and there are 2 suspected arsons. NTD's Eileen Ang has more.
2 arson suspects have been detained after investigators found the fire near Topanga State Park to be suspicious. The Palisades fire burned over 1,300 acres since it broke out late Friday night.
Thankfully, we have had no structures destroyed or damaged, and no residents reported any injuries.
1 suspect has been detained and released. Another was also arrested for questioning. Their details were not released. About 1,000 residents are under evacuation orders, while others were warned they should get ready to leave.
There are other areas, if the fire moves in certain ways, that could be later subject to voluntary evacuations.
However, some local residents are blaming their government for making poor decisions. A group of protesters gathered to recall Mike Bonin, a Los Angeles City Council member who was responsible for setting up a homeless encampment nearby.
He is incompetent at handling a problem, and he actually does worse. He makes the problem worse. So he wants to bring that problem to us and take the very spot that we depend on for fire safety. No, Mike, not on our watch. We're going to recall you before November's out.
They want to keep the homeless out of their parks and said that they can stay in other places. So far, NTD News, California.
Americans have more freedom when it comes to wearing masks now after the CDC loosened its mask guidance. But California is still sticking with its own guidance. We hear more from NTD's David Lamb.
The CDC recently allowed fully vaccinated Americans to resume activities as they did pre-pandemic. Most settings don't require having to wear a mask or social distance, but California is sticking with its own mandate until June 15th. It plans to then fully reopen the economy.
Yeah, that's the nationwide thing, but there's also state level and then there's city level. And in San Francisco right now, there's still a mask mandate for indoor activities.
Currently in California, masks are not required outdoors for vaccinated individuals. They are still required in crowded environments. The California Secretary of Health and Human Services said in indoor settings outside of one's home, including public transportation and schools, face coverings continue to be required regardless of vaccination status. Some people are happy to get rid of the mask.
And then mixed emotions because understanding that not everybody is getting vaccinated. So how are we going to patrol this?
But stores such as Walmart, Target, and Costco announced they will not force customers who are vaccinated to wear masks unless the state requires them. David Lamb, NTD News.
Coming up, Chinese state media say the U.S. will be defeated in a war with China if it happens in China's waters. This after China simulated an invasion of Taiwan. And as tensions run high between the Philippines and China, the Filipino president says he will not back down, even if it costs his life. That and more after the break. A Chinese state-owned media is threatening the U.S. with its strongest language so far. It says China will be able to defeat the U.S. in a war if the war happens in China's waters. This after Beijing simulated an invasion of Taiwan during a military exercise. NTD's Don Ma has more.
The possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan may be more likely than ever. This as the Chinese regime's People's Liberation Army, or PLA, simulated an invasion of the island last week. The PLA Navy practiced one of the most important maneuvers needed to invade Taiwan. That is, beach landing drills. Taiwan is surrounded by water, so an invasion by sea is one of the only methods. The The PLA Navy released a video showing that the exercise involved an amphibious military transport dock, landing crafts, and armored vehicles. The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has never ruled Taiwan, but has long claimed it as its own territory, and has never ruled out annexing it by force. Chinese state-owned media Global Times says the exercises are to prove to foreign countries that China has the ability to conduct a reunification by force operation on Taiwan. It says these exercises act as a deterrent for foreign forces who provoke China. Despite the warning, the U.S. and its allies conducted joint military exercises the following day. The week-long exercises aim to counter Beijing's aggression in the region. The U.S., Japan, Australia, and France participated. The drills took place on Japanese soil and surrounding waters and were the first of its kind. They involved urban warfare and amphibious operations, including the defense of remote islands. The Chinese state media was quick to denounce the joint exercises. It called the exercises insignificant. It also doubled down on its previous threat to Australia, saying that Australia will be the first to receive a missile attack if it interferes in a conflict over Taiwan. The state media also issued its strongest threat yet to the U.S. It said, with China's strength, it needs to make the U.S. be increasingly sure that if the U.S. launches a war with the People's Liberation Army in China's adjacent waters, it will be defeated. Don Ma, NTD News.
The Philippines rejects a demand from Beijing to remove its ships from disputed waters. The nation's president says he will not back down, even if it costs his life. NTD's Tiffany Meyer has more.
In his strongest language yet, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte says he will not yield to Beijing in the South China Sea. In a televised address on Friday, he said, "I will not back down. Kill me if you want to kill me. I will be here. Our friendship will end here." The statement comes against Beijing's call for the Philippines to withdraw vessels from disputed waters in the South China Sea. The Philippines recently boosted its presence in its waters in the defiance of incursions by Chinese ships. Last Wednesday, Beijing sent close to 300 ships into the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. And Duterte says, "We have a stand here, and I want to state it here again. We will not move an inch backward." The Chinese regime self-proclaims over 90% of the South China Sea. This despite a 2016 ruling labeling the claims unlawful. Last week, the Philippine military also announced plans to turn islands in the South China Sea into military hubs. New Zealand police are concerned about the Chinese drones they use. Their report says Chinese-made drones are potential backdoors for Beijing's surveillance efforts. These small flying devices could send data to a server located in China. The company behind the drones is China's Dalian Innovations, or DJI. DJI currently dominates the global market. Their products account for 70% of all drones worldwide. The company is based in Shenzhen, China's Silicon Valley. In 2017, the Chinese regime rolled out a law that forces China-based companies to share data with the regime upon request. That same year, the U.S. military warned against using China-made drones. The Australian and the New Zealand military did the same. New Zealand-based aircraft specialist Andrew Shelley told local radio station RNZ his recommendations: police should use the drones without Wi-Fi. New Zealand police are currently using these drones to photograph crime scenes and traffic accidents. In February, they returned a missing hiker to her family using remote-controlled aircrafts.
Beijing is acknowledging that the U.S. has suspended visas for Chinese Communist Party officials and their families. The new visa curb applies to officials working at 4 major regime agencies involved in human rights abuses. Here are the details.
Beijing confirmed that the U.S. is rejecting visa applications from the family members of Communist Party officials. A spokesman for China's foreign ministry confirmed the news in a press conference on Thursday. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has ordered the suspension of visas for active members of 4 Communist Party agencies: the China's Immigration Bureau, the State Supervisory Commission, the Ministry of State Security, and the Ministry of Public Security. The order also extends to officials' family members. The policy impacts visas for business, tourism, study, and exchange. The new restriction seems to have already taken effect. A Chinese undergraduate freshman was reportedly rejected by the U.S. Embassy. The student's father works for the China's Ministry of Public Security. The note from U.S. visa officers also mentions the rejection of family members and spouses was issued as per U.S. State Secretary's instructions. A spokeswoman for the Chinese aide says she's just received the related updates. She explained, "I just read about the information. My colleague sent me a U.S. visa alert. It reads that the issuance of visas for the people mentioned and their immediate families are suspended." A week earlier, Blinken's 2020 report on international religious freedom said Chinese citizen Yu Hui would be denied entry to the U.S. along with his immediate family. Blinken cited Yu's involvement in Beijing's widespread persecution of Falun Gong, a spiritual meditation practice founded in 1992 that teaches the principles of truth, compassion, and tolerance. Yu Hui was the director of the former 610 office in Chengdu City, Sichuan Province. The office was set up by former Chinese Communist Party head Jiang Zemin for the purpose of persecuting and eradicating Falun Gong. The practice was deemed illegal in 1999 out of fear that its teachings and widespread popularity would promote a more free-thinking moral society and lead people to question the Communist Party's ultimate authority. Currently, the U.S. has sanctions levied on dozens of Chinese Communist officials for their human rights abuses, including the persecution of Falun Gong and the suppression of Hong Kongers, the Uyghur ethnic minority, and other dissidents. The sanctions ban U.S. entry to these officials and their immediate families. Those blacklisted may also have their U.S. assets frozen, with other financial penalties.
Coming up, AT&T offloading its media unit, WarnerMedia, reversing its largest deal ever from just 3 years ago. WarnerMedia is now set to partner up with Discovery to focus on streaming services. That and more on NTD News. It looks like there will be another big player in the streaming space soon. AT&T is spinning off its WarnerMedia division and merging it with Discovery. We don't know the name of the new company yet, but it seems the idea is to have enough content to compete with Netflix and Disney. Here's NTD's Evelyn Lee with more.
AT&T announces a deal worth $43 billion, merging its unit WarnerMedia with Discovery. The deal will create a new and standalone business. Its name will be disclosed by next week. And Discovery President and CEO David Zaslav will be the one leading the new company.
For AT&T, this is a humiliating defeat. They entered this business just 3 years ago, paying $109 billion for it. They're selling it today for something like $50 billion.
According to Keith Snyder at CFRA Research, the merger creates a content behemoth. It brings together Hollywood's most powerful studios, including the Harry Potter and Batman franchises, with Discovery's variety of unscripted shows. The new company will be in direct competition with Netflix and Disney.
And it makes sense for Discovery as well, because Discovery needs scale, and bringing HBO Max and Discovery Plus together really does give them a long-term growth platform that can be competitive against Netflix and Disney.
Snyder also says that the deal isn't surprising. Pressure on traditional pay TV ramped up during the pandemic, with all the people stuck at home binge-watching shows. This move highlights that TV viewership is moving to streaming. Zaslav says the new company will spend about $20 billion on content combined. That's more than Netflix will spend this year. And he said he expects to increase programming investment in the future. It's not immediately clear what the new company means for customers, but it likely allows the bundling of streaming services. The deal is expected to close by the middle of next year. It still needs approval from Discovery shareholders. Evelyn Lee, NTD News.
And prices continue to rise. The average U.S. gas price hit a 7-year high today. Many filling stations in the southeast are still without fuel as the region slowly recovers from a cyber attack on the nation's largest fuel pipeline. NTD's Christina Kim takes a look.
Retail gasoline prices in the U.S. hit a 7-year high on Monday, even after Colonial Pipeline resumed normal service over the weekend. AAA said the national gas price on Monday hit $3.04 a gallon, the highest since October 2014. Colonial Pipeline delivers around 45% of the fuel for the East Coast. It halted operations last week after hackers attacked it. The shutdown stopped millions of barrels of gasoline and diesel from flowing to the East Coast, causing panic buying of fuel and a surge in prices. A spokesperson for AAA said the Southeast would continue to experience tight supply this week as terminals and gas stations get refueled. AAA also expects more price fluctuations leading up to Memorial Day weekend. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Ron Johnson says the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack has exposed existential-scale vulnerabilities in America's fuel and electrical grid.
What we should all take away from this is understand how incredibly vulnerable our fuel grid is, our electrical grid is, and do something about it.
Johnson called for the investment in backup systems and for those responsible for the attack to be punished. Christina Kim, NTD News.
All across the eastern U.S., billions of red-eyed, yellow-winged bugs are emerging from the ground. NTD's Sapphire Corder tells us more about this exceptional brood of cicadas.
Climbing trees, hiding in the grass, under your garden stones. If you live in the eastern United States, you're going to encounter at least one of the billions of cicadas emerging this year. Cicadas come up from underground every year, just long enough to lay their eggs before dying. But this is a special year. Brood X has emerged. They're a type of periodical cicada, which takes years to mature underground. Brood X takes 17 years and is the largest of the 17-year broods. Being the largest, it's also the loudest.
There we go, that's the cicada wave. Hey Willie, how you doing?
But while they look a little unsettling, they're completely harmless.
They don't bite, they don't sting, they're not gonna harm you or your pets.
Or your garden, experts say. In fact, they have basically no ability to defend themselves.
Cicadas have one of the most bizarre strategies for survival of any creature on planet Earth. It's called predator satiation. They're going to emerge in such massive numbers synchronously, they'll fill the belly of every predator that wants to eat them, and there'll still be enough left over to perpetuate their species.
That's a lot of cicadas. Sapphire Corder, NTD News.
Breathtaking views of New York's iconic skyline will soon be available from an all-new observation deck. Located in Midtown Manhattan, this skyscraper ranks among the city's tallest. NTD's Andrew Thomas has the story.
1,100 feet above New York City, the 93rd floor of One Vanderbilt offers incredible views of the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Statue of Liberty. The 1,401-foot tall skyscraper is the tallest building in Midtown Manhattan, and the fourth tallest in New York City. The $3.3 billion development next to Grand Central Terminal features Summit One Vanderbilt, a 4-level, 65,000 square foot space at the top of the building.
We're already seeing the city reopening right now. You know, it's May, and there's a whole vibe in the city now that really didn't exist as much as 2 or 3 months ago. I think this is the right moment for Summit One Vanderbilt when people are going to be fully vaccinated, ready to get out of their homes.
The building's all-glass elevator is named Ascent. It travels up the outside of the building to views that soar 1,200 feet above the city. Visitors will be able to step out in glass skyboxes called levitation. They suspend guests 1,000 feet above Madison Avenue.
When you sit up here and you look out at this vista, I mean, there's no better shot, I don't think, of downtown, the Empire State Building. We've got views out to Jones Beach, Sandy Hook, and West Point to the north, and it's just very exhilarating.
Summit One Vanderbilt opens to the public on October 21st. Andrew Thomas, NTD News.
Coming up, as the UK continues to ease its pandemic restrictions, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is calling for a heavy dose of caution. This as cases of the Indian variant are on the rise. And we hear from people in London who tell us how they're feeling about theaters reopening. The entertainment venues are allowed to open as of Monday, but only at 50% capacity and with protective measures in place. That and more on NTD News. England is entering a new step in lockdown easing, with indoor socializing and physical contact being allowed again. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is calling for a heavy dose of caution.
In a video released by 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says England can move to step 3 of the roadmap out of lockdown. He says this is due to the success of the vaccination programme and people following the rules. Johnson says the roadmap to freedom is irreversible, but reminds people to be careful. He gives a warning about hugging loved ones, saying it could risk transmitting the disease, and suggests considering whether they have been vaccinated first. The Prime Minister said on Friday the government is accelerating the rollout of the second dose of vaccines. Johnson says the government is keeping the spread of the Indian variant under close observation and taking swift action where infection rates are rising.
I want us to trust people to be responsible and to do the right thing. That's the way to live with this virus while protecting the NHS and restoring our freedoms. And it's very clear now we're going to have to live with this new variant of the virus as well for some time.
Ministers are hoping surge testing and vaccines will allow a safe opening up of the nation, with jabs due to be extended to the over 35s this week. But on Sunday, Health Secretary Matt Hancock did not rule out the possibility of imposing local lockdowns in areas such as Bolton to tackle the Indian variant. He says the variant is spreading like wildfire among the unvaccinated groups and called for as many people to be vaccinated as possible.
I would stress that this is from the labs, it's not clinical data, and it is very early, but it does give us a degree of confidence that the vaccines work against this Indian variant, but it is clearly more transmissible.
Hancock said the UK has found more than 1,300 cases of the Indian variant.
Like in the rest of the world, the pandemic shut down theatres in England. As of Monday, they will be able to welcome back audiences, but only at 50% capacity and with protective measures in place. NTD's Neil Woodrow brings us the reaction from London's West End.
The last but one reopening day under the government's roadmap out of lockdown comes at a very testing time as the pandemic grabs people's attention again. But looking on the positive side, people can go inside a restaurant and eat a meal, visit museums, cinemas and theatres. We spoke to some theatregoers whether they'll be taking advantage of the latest release of lockdown measures. These ladies will book, but maybe not right away.
I think we've had so many things this year where things have opened, closed. I think I'll just be waiting to avoid disappointments.
This gentleman saw a pantomime in December.
I live in London, near Covent Garden, and walking around this area in the last year has been strange, to see the theatres closed most of the time.
This lady has just booked for Phantom of the Opera in October.
Oh God, I'm so excited. I was just so happy to finally be able to book and not see we have to reschedule, but actually book and hopefully know that this is going to be something. So I'm really excited for it. And I'm even going past the theatre now just to have a look and say finally we can start going to the theatres.
That's how the public feels, but how about the performers?
Oh, it feels wonderful. It feels heartwarming. It feels exciting, exhilarating. It feels like coming back home, really. It's the last show that most of us have done before this madness happened, and so it's a great way to get back to a different version of the life before 2020.
Lighting designer Elliot Griggs had to make ends meet in between.
I was working for Tesco for the whole of the last year whilst theatres have been closed. So I sort of almost feel guilty that I'm opening one of the very first shows back into the West End. So many people are still waiting for that call to come. So I sort of feel very lucky to be here and back doing this job.
Some shows open today, but others open later. This one behind me opens on May 20th. Neil Woodrow, NTD News, West End, London.
And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox.
Don't miss out on important news. Our videos are being deleted. So if you don't want to be cut off from honest news, take a moment to sign up for our newsletter at newsletter.ntd.com so you don't lose access to NTD. Go to newsletter.ntd.com to sign up for our evening newsletter.